Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from the Creative Penn, and today I am here with New York Times and USA Today bestselling and award-winning thriller and mystery author Rebecca Cantrell. Hi Becky.
Hi, Joanna. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on the show. And, we've known each other a few years now, but you actually haven't been on this podcast before. You've been on my other show on the thriller site. So I'm really thrilled to have you on this show today. So first of all, tell people a bit more about you and your writing background and why you're in Berlin.
Those are complicated questions. So I'm one of those writers, like most writers, who always knew this is what I wanted to do from the time I was a little girl. And then after my son was born, I think I kind of realized the clock was ticking. And so shortly after he was born, I started the novel that would become my first published novel, which was set in Berlin in the 1930s. So that was called A Trace of Smoke, and it's set in 1931 Berlin. And we moved here, and as soon as we moved here, I stopped writing Berlin novels because I like to make my life complicated. So I wrote them all from Hawaii and did all my research remotely, and then kind of got to come here once for a research trip. But otherwise, it was all using stuff from the 1930s, which is fine because Berlin has changed so much in the ensuing 80 years that it's not the same city that I end up writing about. So I wrote those books, and then I also wrote a series with James Rollins. That's a trilogy, the Order of the Sanguines trilogy. Those are vampire books, vampire thrillers that are set between the birth of Christ and now. So, we cover a lot of time and a lot of territory.
Ground. Yeah.
Well, vampires, they have a long lifespan, so it's kind of epic usually. And then I write the Joe Tesla series, which are set in New York in the subways underneath New York City, and that's about a software developer named Joe Tesla who gets agoraphobia and can't go outside. So he decides to make the inside bigger and moves into an apartment under a house under Grand Central Station, and all the stories take place under there. And then I'm also working on a series with Sean Black, who's a British thriller writer, and those are set in Malibu. And the first one's called A is for Asshat, and I'm working on the fourth one now. So it's kind of wonderful to try to spend all day in Malibu when you're in Berlin in January and February, because the sun is always shining there, and there's beach, and seagulls, and I lived in Hawaii for 10 years, so I really miss it in the winter when it gets kind of dark and cold. So it's nice to be able to escape to Malibu and just fun comedy romp stuff for a while.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to your multi-genre writing because you really are dipping into all kinds of things. But first of all, just want to come back on your research. So obviously, you were writing about 1930s Berlin from Hawaii, and now you're writing Malibu from Berlin, and then you've written, these. So just going back to the 1930s Berlin, how were you doing that research? Because a lot of writers can't travel to the places they want to write about. How do you research a place and a time where you are not?
Well, for 1930s Berlin, I was very, very lucky because there's so much primary source material available. So for that one, there's a lot of diaries and books that were written by people who were there. And since it was the run-up to World War II, those materials got published and were part of the public consciousness. So I read a lot of diaries and newspapers, things like that are online now, although they weren't when I started. And I bought this giant bound edition of the Berlin Illustrated newspaper called Berlin Illustrierte Zeitung. And it had 6 months of newspapers from 1931, and they were illustrated. So it had all the pictures of the city and what was going on and what jokes were, and it had a little, crossword puzzles at the end. And so when you read through, and ads, and so when you read through that, you were kind of immersed in the world. And then Berlin was also, because of the economic condition, they were creating a lot of films and exporting them. So a lot of Hollywood exported films came from here. So like M with Peter Lorre was filmed in Berlin in 1931. Berlin Symphony of the City was filmed in 1928. So, and that is a movie it's a silent film where you walk through Berlin all day long. And so it starts out, you're going to factories and you get to see factory workers and, women at desks and typists and all this kind of stuff through the whole day, through the whole city. And you get a really good sense of what it was like. So there's a ton of information available. And then by the time I got to the later books, there was more stuff on YouTube. So when I wrote A Game of Lies, which is set during the Olympics, you could find people's home movies from 1936 on YouTube. And British BBC did a little, or Germany did an ad that they sent to Britain about, come to the Olympics, it's wonderful. And so they had all these film clips of Berlin, and it was in color. So it was a very early color movie. And so you could see the colors of cars. And I had no idea that the cars, they had yellow cars and powder blue cars and bright green cars. I don't know, I guess because you see all the black and white movies, I think, well, the cars back then were black, white, and gray. But it turns out they were completely as bright as they are now. So that was a lot of fun to see that and just look at all the images from that time. And so you really can get a lot done. And I'd lived in Berlin for years, and that helped a lot. So I knew the feel of the city and the smell of the city and the cobblestones and those kinds of things that you could work in. But I think you can do a lot with primary sources. But I would really say, this is my historian background. I would say go to the words of the people who live where you want to write, when you want to write it. So, it's good to get a background from historical texts, that are worked, that come out later, like Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. So that was written by William Shirer, but he also wrote diaries when he was in Berlin. And those are more interesting because your characters don't know the future.
Yeah, I think biography is it takes a lot to find the gems in some biographies, but you can get quite a lot from that type of detail. And of course, YouTube is amazing for people's home. I've been looking at Elora's Cave, which not the romance site, the actual caves in India, and there's all these home movies of the caves, and just with people talking, and it's just awesome. So yeah, YouTube is brilliant for research.
Oh yeah, for the Joe Tesla stuff, which is set in the subway under New York, there's a lot of urban explorers who go down there with cameras, and they just film themselves walking through the tunnels and what's going on, and so you get to see all these hidden places. And even 10 years ago, unless you happened to be in New York, you'd never, ever see that material. So yeah, it's a wonderful time to be a writer.
Yeah, and it's funny because you and I both get obsessed with the same things, and I used the same urban explorers in One Day in New York. And I love seeing how, and I was in Prague recently, and you used Prague in the last Sanguines book, didn't you, as well? And it's what I love is when we all do a different take on the same places.
There's so many places that seem kind of magical where you go there just like, ooh, this place has some kind of energy or some kind of story inherent in it. And I think that writers pick up on that, and you're like, okay, there's something about this moment and this place that strikes you. And it strikes every writer differently, but I think there are certain places that just resonate a lot.
Yeah, and learning to follow that curiosity, like as soon as you feel something like that is the feeling to me that means I should write about it. But
exactly.
But if you wind back time, like how does a new writer or someone who doesn't trust their instincts so much, how do you learn to trust that writer's instincts and choose the right story, I guess?
I think that's a tough one. I think that you need to trust your instinct and then really do the research and immerse yourself in it. And I think it's something we don't tell writers enough, and we really should, is that it's okay to have fun. So it's okay to go someplace that you think is fascinating and wander around and sit in, like I had a book that I was going to set in Venice, and I happened to be in Venice, and I actually didn't write that book till years later, but I sat in a cafe in Venice on St. Mark's Square, and I drank hot chocolate in this little cafe that had been around since the 1700s. And it was, the chocolate was real chocolate that they melted in the milk. And, that feels completely indulgent because it was nothing but fun. It was fantastic hot chocolate, and the setting was gorgeous. And, Venice, you can't take a bad picture of Venice. I'm not sure you can sit anywhere in Venice that isn't just beautiful. But as a writer, it's okay to have fun. It's okay to enjoy those moments. And it's okay to really indulge your senses, because that's where the gold is. Those specific moments that you love and you connect with will connect with the readers. And that took me a long time to really believe. I think I was working with James Rollins on something, and I was like, so I think this, but is that dumb? And he's like, no, I found that if I think it's cool, other people think it's cool. And I think that's true. I think trust the readers and trust yourself. Have fun. If you have fun, it'll show. And there's a reason why you're having fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So coming on to your co-writing, so you've written with James Rollins, which is how I found you in the first place, because I've been a Rollins fan for years, and then with the Sanguines, I discovered you, which was cool, and then Sean Black. Now, the Malibu Mystery is that's a funny, like, that's humor, isn't it? Whereas the Rollins stuff is supernatural thriller, but it's not funny. I mean, I can't. It's quite. I really love those books, but they're not funny. So how do
They're
you?
not funny. There might be a funny moment here or there, but they would not be shelved under comedies. No.
No. So how? So these are very different books, two very different co-authors. So what are some of your tips, first of all, for successfully collaborating in such different projects?
Well, I think part of it is you need to find a writer that you mesh with. You need to find someone that you can work with, who you trust. And then I think you need to check your ego at the door, and you need to, get a shared vision and concentrate on the story and the characters and where those are going to take you. So for both projects, one of the things we did is we created a world Bible early on, where we talked about what our vision of the characters were, what our vision of the world was. And then for the series with James Rollins, we did a lot of backing and forthing on the same scenes, writing scenes and moving them back and forth. Whereas with Sean, he used to be in television. And so he kind of set it up with a kind of more of a showrunner mentality, where we brainstorm all the content of the outlines. We have much more structured outlines than I did in my project with Jim. And then we go away and we each write a book. So, he wrote A, I wrote B, he wrote C, I'm writing D. And then we edit it at the end to make it be consistent. But it's a very different way of working. And then we're kind of more brainstorming for the scenes, and then, the humor within the scenes. And so he'd written a lot of funny stuff. And one of the reasons I did the project was because I wanted to learn to write more funny stuff. Because I have some funny moments in my books, but they're not funny. And I thought, that would be a cool skill. That would be kind of a fun thing to go off and do. And as a writer, and I know this is probably not what the advice you'd get from an agent, but as a writer, I always am trying to challenge myself and do something new and do something different and push and grow. And I know that all my readers won't like all my books. And I know that, some of my thriller readers will not want to read a comedy mystery because that's not their genre. But I think as a writer, you owe it to yourself to follow your muse and to follow your interests, even if it's not necessarily what would be considered the most commercial thing at the time. So that's it comes back to, challenging yourself and not being afraid to have fun.
Yeah, and that's important. But so you started off there by saying it's about finding someone you can work with. Yeah. But how do you find someone you can work with?
That is tough. I mean, with James Rollins, we had met years before, so we'd known each other for, I don't know, we've known each other 5 or 6 years now. So we'd known each other for 2 or 3 years. And he had been my instructor at the Maui Writers Conference. So he was familiar with my work and my working style. And I was familiar with his books, and I knew him as a person, and we'd worked on various projects for ITW. So I knew him fairly well when we started. And the same thing with Sean Black. So his first book came out the same year as my first book, Trace of Smoke. His first book was Lockdown. And so we'd known each other since then. So we'd kind of grown up as thriller writers together, and we've been emailing back and forth. And he got into self-publishing earlier than I did. So he had books that were quite successful in the UK, and he self-published them in the US and did really well. So he was kind of, encouraging me through that stage of, what do I do now? How does this work stuff? So I'd known him for years. So I don't know if that helps, but I knew them both fairly well, and I'd worked with them on smaller projects before we got to the bigger, writing a whole giant novel or series together phase.
And I think that's important. And Jay Thorne, who I've co-written with, I've known online for years. I have never met him in person. Maybe we never will meet in person. But I think it's about, there's a level of trust when you know somebody over time and you've read their books and you can trust what level they're at, I suppose. That trust is so important, isn't it? Because it's a big commitment. It's basically bigger than marriage because it goes on after your death.
It goes on after your death, and it takes a huge amount of time. Like, writing a book is a huge creative commitment because you have to, sit down and spend a large part of your day in that universe. And unless you want to be in that universe and trust everybody in that universe, it could be a miserable experience. So how did you do collaboration? So did you guys do alternate chapters or alternate books?
We did a whole podcast on that, so I won't go into it on this show. But
Okay.
Jay, for the listeners, Jay and I did a podcast on collaboration. Back in November, I think it was October or November, I think it was, and I should also say in the show notes I will reference the thing you and I did on vampires as well.
Okay.
But we did a really great conversation about the gates of hell and vampires. So for everybody listening, there will be more audios in the show notes. But coming back onto the different genres, so you started off in like really historical fiction,
Yeah.
And then supernatural, paranormal, the humor, mystery, what's so interesting is I fit squarely in the middle as a reader and a fan. I sit in the middle with the supernatural thriller, but you've got this quite disparate arc. And then you also did some under Becca Black, didn't you? Sort of YA.
Yeah, I did. I, Dracula and I, Frankenstein. And I, Dracula was one of the first cell phone novels. And so it was the retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula using just what you would find on a phone. So it's cell phone texts and browsers and phone messages and things like that. And that was kind of a different narrative structure, which was a lot of fun. It was a very interesting way to tell a story. And then I, Frankenstein was another one in that vein.
So how do you, obviously you said as a writer, it's very important to you to be able to explore these different things, but as a businesswoman and a full-time professional author making a living this way, how are you making it clear about these genres, and how are you marketing across genre?
Say for the Joe Tesla books, those are traditional thrillers. So I make sure I have a traditional thriller type cover, so when people look at it, they know what to expect. Whereas with the Malibu series, those are, mysteries, and so comedy mysteries. So they have a very different cover. So they tend to have it's a silhouette of a woman, and there's a background in Malibu or something, and there's the big letter. So that's kind of branding that as a fun, light mystery. And then over here I have the darker, more abstract thrillers. And so there's the choices that you make with cover, and I'm very, very explicit in my product description so people know exactly what they're getting, because I don't want someone to buy A is for asshat and think it's like Joe Tesla, because it just isn't. And I, Dracula isn't like, The World Beneath, and it isn't like A Trace of Smoke. So you start off with making sure that it's visually clear, that it's clear in your marketing material. And then when I do blog tours or when I do advertising, I make sure that I kind of point it in the direction where it goes. So for example, for the A is for Asshat mysteries, those are more fans of Janet Ivanovich, comedy type stuff. And for Joe Tesla, those are more fans like James Rollins, Steve Barry, traditional thriller writers with a bit of high tech in them, and maybe a little bit of history too. So it's about finding your readers and making sure that you give them what they expect, because I think it's a story is a promise that you make to the reader, and you want to make sure that you're promising the truth, because you don't want to disappoint the readers. You want to be upfront and let them know what they're getting, because otherwise they will be rightfully angry and they won't like it. I mean, you might get some that'll be happy and they wouldn't have expected that genre was something they loved, and then they did. But you get others who are like, okay, I read A is for Asshat and there were no vampires.
Yeah.
What are you thinking? So, you want to make that clear.
Yeah. And so how do you know what to write next? Because, of course, the Joe Tesla is an ongoing series. The Sanguines was a trilogy, although as a fan, I would like another one. But I don't think I'll be getting one, right? But it's no, exactly. And then you've got this, and of course, as soon as you start an alphabet series, like what's the famous woman who Sue Grafton
is Alibi through. She's on X, I think now.
Yeah, she's. Isn't it just called X as well? It's just a big.
X, yeah. I guess she didn't want to do X's for X-ray, because that's all you got.
Yeah. So obviously with that, you're going to have to carry on with that through. But how do you know when? I mean, that's a risk in a way, because if it doesn't take off, do you want to do 26 books? And what if people want Tesla books, or what if the Hannah Vogel historical stuff takes off? So how do you know where to spend your time over your year? How do you plan out your production?
Artistically, I plan it out with where I have the most energy which projects I'm the most obsessed with. But as a business person, I know that I should write a Joe Tesla book this year, and I should write another alphabet book this year. And with the Hannah books, right now the copyright is with Macmillan, and so I can't produce anything more in that series without getting that back. So for that one, I'm trying to figure out where to go with that one. But with the other two, it's just, I know I need to do it, and then I just kind of plan out. So I'm finishing up the D is for Dirtbag this in the next couple of months, and then I will turn to a Tesla, and I'll probably be alternating those because the alphabet books are quick and they're funny and they're light and they're quicker to write because they're shorter and there's a lot more dialogue and a lot more humor. So those go a little bit faster. So I usually do those in between books to kind of give myself a palate cleanser as I switch from one to the other. So I like my books do better in the fall and in the year. So I want to plan my releases around the time of year as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And then I wanted to ask you about the award-winning thing too, because I had somebody emailed me and said that I only ever interview best-selling genre writers. Why can't I interview people who win awards? Now, you are an award-winning author. You've won quite a few, haven't you? With one of the being you tell me.
Okay, yes. So I've won the McCavity Award, the Bruce Alexander Award, and the International Thriller Writers Best Ebook Original Award. And then I've been nominated for the Americans Clark, which is part of the Edgars, the Barry Archie Best Historical. I don't want to leave anything off. Goodreads Choice. So I've been nominated for several and won some. And I can also fall in that category if you need me to.
Yeah, well, I want you to. So essentially, you write genre fiction about vampires who do stuff, and you're an award-winning author. So how, if people want to win awards, and some people do you have any advice for writing something that could be entered into an award? Like, is there a literary quality that you're adding that has put you into that sort of vein, I guess?
Well, part of it depends on the award. So for my self-published books, I can't even be nominated for a lot of the awards that I've already won. So, the Edgars and the Barry and I think also the RT awards. So for some of them, you're just out of the running altogether unless you're traditionally published. But boy, I don't know. I mean, I do try to make my books as well written as I possibly can and to be as thorough as I can and take my time and go over them. And I do read a lot of literary fiction. I did get a degree in creative writing. So I am coming from that tradition. But I don't think I sit down and consciously decide to make the book more or less literary. I think it's just the story that you want to tell to the best of your ability, and you want to have as much depth in it as you can and do the best job you can word for word. But beyond that, I don't have any great advice on how to do that. So I don't know. I don't know if that helps at all.
Well, no, I think it's interesting that your career has kind of spanned both sides, and I don't think a lot of best-selling genre fiction authors have won a lot of awards. I think it is quite unusual, unless it's within like the ITW, the International Thriller Writers, people winning thriller awards for genre thrillers. But I think it's really interesting and maybe something for us to think about and come back to. But I also, you mentioned there about being a hybrid author in that you span traditional publishing and indie publishing. So what made you look at self-publishing and, how's it going for you?
Well, when I finished the Joe Tesla books, I had a lot of friends like C.J. Lyons and you and Sean Black, Robert Gregory Brown, Brett Battles, who were already doing self-publishing, and they were like, come on in, the water's great. And so I thought, I can give this a try. And I like the idea of having control, and I like the idea of being able to publish what I want when I want, and I like the idea of being able to branch out as much as I want. So I gave it a shot and I love it. Oh my God, it's fantastic. I am very, very happy with how it's been going. It's just a wonderful. I have a terrific cover designer. I have a strong editor. I mean, so I'm working with and both of them work in traditional publishing as well. So I have the same caliber of people working for me as I did in traditional publishing. So I don't think the quality is any different than it was before I became hybrid, which was important to me. I wanted to make sure that the quality of my books didn't go down. So I have a copy, I have a copy editor, I have my developmental editors, and I have my cover designer, and I make sure that everything is as good as it can possibly be before it goes out there, because you owe your readers nothing less than the best than what you can produce. But I love self-publishing. I love being able to change my price. I love being able to change my cover, change my description. When things go wrong, as they often do, I love being able to fix it right away. If somebody, sends me mail and says, "I have a typo on page 27," I can have it fixed by, the next day or the day after, depending on how long it takes Amazon to roll it out. But before, you'd have to hold it for a year and hope that it got into the next release. And oftentimes things don't. And so it's wrong forever. And that drives me crazy. So I love all of that. And I love being able to, do sales and respond more to my readers. And it's a good gig.
Yeah, it's amazing hearing that from you because, of course, you're, amazingly traditionally published and hit the New York Times. But maybe you could share that story of what happened in that situation and how traditional publishing sometimes gets it wrong.
Well, the first time I hit the New York Times bestseller list was with a project that I did with James Rollins, and they left my name off the list. So the publisher had rolled the book out without my name on it. So the first time I hit the list, I didn't. And it was corrected afterwards. But that happened. And it happened a couple of times, more than once. And so when that happened, that's the moment you've waited for all your life. And then when you see your book up there and your name isn't on it, it's tough. And it reminds you that, there's a heart to the writing of books and to these things that you want to do and plan to do. And that does need to be addressed. And I think it's easy to forget that when it's just a product that someone puts out and it's one of, 100 books that they'll put out in that, 2-month period or whatever. And so the advantage of being self-published is, the person who cares the most about the book, me, is in charge of it and fixing it and getting it out there. And so, there's wonderful things that happen too. Like I could see my book in airports. My book was in Costco. When I did tours for the Hannah Vogel books or the books with James Rollins, when you went into a bookstore, they have this little shrine where they have your book up everywhere. And that's wonderful. And those are things as a writer you always wanted to see. As a kid, I hung out in bookstores. And so to see myself in a bookstore gave me that sense of place. And traditional publishing is the best way to get that. I mean, my Joe Tesla books, certainly, you can order them from independent bookstores, and I think people do, but they don't have them there on display on a shelf, for anybody to see. So it's a different kind of relationship with the print and the visibility than you have. So there's trade-offs between both.
There's trade-offs, but right now, you're only indie?
Right now, I'm only indie. So my last traditionally published project would be Blood Infernal with James Rollins, and the paperback for that comes out today, and that's the last in that series. That's the last edition of that's coming out. And so right now I'm only indie.
Yeah.
And I would go back to traditional publishing, but I would have to have a very good contract. I mean, I kind of know what I can do on my own, and I would have to get a contract where I believe that they could do more than I could do on my own.
I think that's what's so interesting now. And I talk to a lot of people who are not super A-list, super famous, where most authors, unless they are that super A-list, can't actually get the contracts that we all now say we would want. It's like we're in this, that there's this shift now where authors kind of know the contract that they want, but unless they're super A-list, they're unlikely to get it. So it will be interesting when that starts shifting again. And we know, like, most of the contracts in the UK right now for Midlist authors, we all know we can make more money self-publishing.
Yeah, exactly. And at some point that has to switcher. I don't know what traditional publishing is going to do. I mean, they need content, and they have, their established writers, but it used to be they would nurture you up across multiple books, and so they were developing their talent in-house that would eventually become the bestseller that would then have a sense of loyalty to them. And that's not the case now. So, as a Midlist author, it's hard to get contracts, it's hard to get good contracts, and it's hard to get contracts that span enough books to get a following, because it's a very rare series that gets a big following with book 1 or even book 2. I think Lee Child said it was book 4 or 5 before his book started being really successful. And then, he's the poster child for successful traditional published author.
So on the sort of attitudes to traditional publishing, self-publishing, a lot of these A-list guys. Have you noticed the attitudes towards indie authors changing as people like yourself, respected authors have shifted?
I think it depends on the person. So there are some A-list. I think there's definitely starting to become a shift, and there's a lot of A-list writers who are kind of looking at traditionally indie published books with a new eye and are less quick to discount them. I think there are still some old guard people who, feel that it's all crap and that there's no way that good stuff could come out of that world. But I think that's a much, much smaller group of people than ever before. I think it is starting to gain mainstream. Even in the A-list writers, is gaining mainstream acceptance. Because as writers, a lot of them have moved houses, and they know that they, how much of their work they're responsible for. And they know that, I didn't become a crappy writer because I moved from St. Martin's to Tor or from St. Martin's to Random House. They know what they did. And I didn't suddenly become a worse writer when I moved from Macmillan or HarperCollins to working on my own. It's not as if there was a magical switch that was flipped and my quality just went down. And so, when I won the Best Ebook Original Award, for instance, that book was up against a slate of traditionally published books. And yet it won. And that kind of shows that the quality is there. And I think if more of the awards were open to indies, I think it would be, I think people would be very surprised at how many indie books would start winning them.
Yeah.
If they were able to.
Exactly. And I think the year before, CJ Lyons won that same award also for another. Yeah. So it is really interesting how that's changing. But I want to talk about Germany now, because you are, you're in Berlin, the correspondent in Berlin. And I wondered if maybe you could just talk a bit about what do you see the current state of reading and books in Germany as compared to America or the UK?
Well, I don't know about the UK, but in Germany, there's definitely more people reading paper books. So when you're on the subway or you're on a plane, there's people just sitting around with paper books. There's not as many Kindles. Some people might be reading on their phones, but it's tough to say without looking over their shoulder. But there's also just more bookstores everywhere. So within, a kilometer of my house, there's four bookstores if you count the comic book store. So there's all these, and if you go 2 kilometers, that widens out to probably 7 bookstores. So there's a ton of books, of just paper bookstores where you go in and get paper books, and specialty stores that I think have disappeared in the US. So there's 2 comic book stores 3 comic book stores within walking distance of my house. There's a bookstore that's just for Italian books within walking distance of my house. There's a big German bookstore called Dussmann's. There's an English version of that bookstore, also both of them walking distance of my house. And there's a lot of paper distribution here. I think there are ebook readers, and I know that there are some German writers who are having a lot of success with ebooks, but I think it's definitely behind where the U.S. is. And they have for example, they also have a lot of vinyl record stores. I remember when I lived in Berkeley in the 90s, there was Rasputin and Tower Records and Virgin and all these big giant music and record stores, and they're all gone now. And so are the big independent bookstores that were in Berkeley at the time, like Cody's and Moe's and those kinds of places that are just gone. And in Germany, those places are still alive. I mean, there's a vinyl record store right around the corner from my house and another one a couple blocks away. So I don't know if it's a time machine or if they're ahead of us and they've kind of moved back to where we're going to be. Because I think vinyl is also starting to gain in the U.S. as well. So maybe we'll come back around, or maybe they'll switch to E.
Yeah, and Germany has the Tolino, doesn't it? Which, in terms of the ebook market that exists, I believe it's around 50%. Can you explain what the Tolino is? As in, it's not like Amazon, is it?
I don't know. I mean, because I use a Kindle and all my friends use Kindles. I don't know
Oh, okay.
anyone who uses a Tolino, although I know it does have a huge part of the market. And I think I've just fallen into the little Kindle corner of the universe here.
So do you shop? You shop on Amazon.de?
Mhm.
Yeah, and you read in German and English, presumably.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but are you kind of aware of the differences between, say, Amazon? What people are reading? Like, what are the popular genres in Germany? You know, are they different to the US or are they similar?
They're very similar. So thrillers and romance are the biggest market here as well. I think they have a little more literary fiction and they have a lot more stuff in translation than the US does. So, Germans are much, much, much more likely to read an American novel in translation than Americans are to read a German novel in translation. There's just, so if you go to the bestseller list, there's, like the Lee Child and James Patterson are up there as well as German authors. But they also have a lot of Scandinavian authors that are translated into German that people are reading too. So it's a much more international
Scene.
group of books.
Yeah, and you don't have your books in German. So, why have you not jumped into self-publishing in German? What are the challenges?
Well, translations in Germany are particularly expensive, I think more than other places. And there are issues with ownership. So the German court has ruled that translators have rights to your books. So if you have your book translated in German and you sell the film rights, the translator of your book into German might be legally entitled to a percentage of your film sales. And it doesn't happen often. It has happened. It's gone all the way up to the federal court, so they're equivalent of the Supreme Court. So it has happened. It could happen again. And I just worry about giving over a percentage of my book to someone who spends just a few months translating it. So I kind of have been hesitant to jump into that, particularly in Germany where the rights are so different. I mean, in the U.S., there's just a standard work for hire contract, and you hire someone and you pay them, and whatever you guys agree on, that's what you pay them. And then when you're done, the person who paid for the work for hire owns it, whereas in Germany, that's not the case. So the case that went to court was about a woman translator who'd been paid to translate a book, and she was paid exactly what she wanted, and she was paid the market rate for the book. And then when the book was successful, she came back and sued the publishing company and said because the book was successful, she deserved a share of that. And they decided that was true, even though her contract had stated otherwise. And that makes it it makes me uneasy to jump into that.
Yeah.
And especially as an indie, because if you're behind if you're hidden behind a publisher, the publisher can absorb those legal costs and they can absorb the accounting costs and they can deal with it. But if you're an author, I don't want to be stuck paying having an accountant figure out what I made and having myself get audited and paying all those payments going forward forever. And particularly if I were to sell film, that could be a substantial amount of what the books ever earn. And I wouldn't like to just give that away. So that's where I stand on it. I know a lot of other people have made a different choice on it, and I know that doesn't happen very often, that the translator comes back and said, you know what, you're successful, give me more money. But the fact that it can just makes me...
Yeah, it's interesting. And both my German translators, neither of them live in Germany. So, so that kind of changes things, I think. But just on other things that are weird in Germany, copyright on book titles.
Yes.
Which I think they are going to run up against problems as self-publishing takes off, don't you think? I just can't see how they're gonna manage.
Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, because so in Germany, book titles and movie titles are copyrighted. So you end up with these just ridiculously long movie titles where they have to describe the whole plot of the movie. So it's something that's a 2-word movie title in English, and in German it's a 12-word movie title, because I guess they couldn't come up with anything that wasn't copyrighted. So they end up, saying, "No, this is the story of the man and the woman who went on a boat and it sank." It was like, wow, you just called it Titanic. And yeah, I think as the volume of titles increases, I don't know how they can keep how they can sustain that.
But it is something for, if indies listening are considering translation, it's something that you have to keep in mind, because you can't, even if you're not in the country, you can't publish a title in German and sell it on Amazon.de with the same title as something else. So that's kind of crazy. But I think we're still in early days, and I think things will probably change over time.
Yeah, well, I think that Germany and France, I don't know about the UK, but Germany and France are definitely trying to protect their local print book marketplaces at the disadvantage of the ebook marketplace. So if you're primarily selling an ebook, which of course indies are, you're already disadvantaged tax-wise and price-wise and in a lot of other ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so really interesting to talk to you about all this stuff. So where can people find you and all your books online?
Well, I have my website, RebeccaCantrell.com, or I'm on Facebook. You can find me there, and on Twitter. And my books are online everywhere. They're on Amazon, they're on Nook, they're on Tolino, they're on the iBook store for Apple, everywhere. And if you go into any of your local bookstores and request my book with a title, the bookstores will order it for you. So you should be able to get a hold of anything, anywhere, anytime.
Maybe. Well, all the best with the book launch today. And thanks so much for your time, Becky.
Thanks for having me.